Welcome to the Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. We're here to share stories of real river accidents and rescues and find expert advice on how to solve the problems you might encounter in the Whitewater River environment. I'm your host, Jack Diddy, an emergency medicine physician, whitewater paddler, and wilderness medicine educator. Together, I hope we can celebrate successful rescues and learn from our mistakes in a supportive environment. If you have a story to share of a non-fatal accident or rescue, send me an email at thesafetybreak@gmail.com or contact me on our Facebook page, The Safety Break. If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button and follow us on social media. I hope you learned something valuable in the show. West Virginia breeds some really tough paddlers. Maybe it's the cold water or the wilderness character and remoteness of the runs, or maybe it's just the old mountaineer heritage. But the culture of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility is beyond comparison. The paddler in this episode really demonstrates these qualities, along with it a very humble and positive attitude about his accident, his injuries, and his healing process. The incident happened at one of the most iconic rapids in the state, Big Splat on Big Sandy Creek in northern West Virginia. This is a world-class whitewater stream, often with clear water and an incredible collection of distinctive ledge drops and waterfalls. The first big one is Wonder Falls, a gorgeous 17-foot clean and forgiving drop into a huge pool, a great place to learn the art of free-falling in a kayak. A little further downstream, however, is a much more complex drop, Big Splat. This one has a complicated entrance series, culminating in a broken ledge drop of about 14 feet, directly onto a large, sharp boulder. The entry moves require the paddler to negotiate some weird slanted ledges and holes, and then you just have a brief moment of reprieve to collect yourself, gather up some momentum, and drive hard right to left to avoid the hard piton onto the rock. If you've got the correct stroke and timing, it's one of the most satisfying boofs anywhere, with a smooth and soft landing. But if you're out of control, it's very unforgiving, and I think the name says it all. This has been the site of a prior fatality and several close calls and serious injuries. The type of injury in this episode is what we classify in the medical field as multi-system trauma. This term means that multiple body systems are affected simultaneously. The victim may have impaired consciousness from a head injury, breathing difficulties, internal bleeding in their chest or abdomen, spinal injury, or multiple fractures or lacerations. It can be incredibly complicated to treat, even in the hospital environment. When dealing with this in the wilderness, it can easily exceed the capabilities of the first responders on scene, no matter their training or the contents of their first aid kits. Many of these victims will need outside resources for extrication, which can eat up valuable time and lead to further complications such as hypothermia or hemorrhagic shock. When training to deal with multi-system trauma, it helps to develop a simple framework to approach it, to pare down the sometimes overwhelming complexities. This is where you may have heard the long-standing mantra of the ABCDEs in the Primary Trauma Survey. This abbreviation stands for airway, breathing, circulation, disability, and exposure. This helps you to focus on the most immediate life-threatening problems, intervene as necessary, and then move on to the next issue. One really important point about patients with multiple trauma is that you can't really trust them. Many of these patients have hidden internal injuries that they don't even know about or feel in the first few hours after the event. And they may have significant head injuries that can impair their judgment, their balance, and their fine motor skills. So you have to treat them somewhat skeptically and cautiously, and really try to get them to definitive medical care as soon as possible. So let's get on with this story. We're going to dissect this one a bit, to think about the framework mentioned above, and how you would assess and evaluate each component of the injuries if you were one of the crew on scene, and how you would handle the decision about extrication from the river environment. This incident occurred on an afternoon this past December, with temperatures in the mid-30s and the river at a good medium flow. Our guests today are Shane McManus and Josh Martin. The rest of the crew with them that day were Jim Murtha, John Rook, and James Malik, and they all did a great job of setting up safety for the rapid, collecting the paddler and gear during the incident, and then extricating him in the most efficient way from the river to the hospital. After we hear their story, keep listening, as we have a second story today from the Big Sandy with a West Virginia whitewater legend to finish off the episode. Here's Shane and Josh to start us out.
I'm Shane McManus. I'm a Morgantown local and a very highly enthused whitewater paddler. Since I was a kid, I got trained kind of fluidly through paddling naturally with Jimmy Snyder and Charlie Walberge, and had a lot of great mentors, Bob Spangler, Warren Wick, all throughout my paddling career. Really took me under their wing and showed me a lot. My best friend Keith Corey and I, we would just be out running creeks a lot of really obscure micro creeks. I've been paddling since I was just probably 8 or 9 years old, something like that. And I've been paddling the Big Sandy and Big Splat for over 10 years.
So, my name's Joshua Martin. Been paddling for about 15 years. I'm very fortunate. I work at a location that is right on a paddleable stretch of river. It's actually the only Army installation located on a commercially rafted river. Camp Dawson's right on the cheat, and I teach technical rescue to National Guard and Air National Guardsmen for disaster response teams all across the country and in the territories as well. I teach rope rescue, confined space, and then structural collapse rescue, as well as swift water as well. Even though I paddled the Sandy a lot of times, I'm pretty a risk-averse individual. I just, I weigh the consequences against things, and Splat was always one of those ones that I just decided to walk. I didn't see the reward versus the risk. And I felt really good. I'd been on the Sandy a lot at a lot of various levels, and we had paddled a couple days before that with a group, and all 3 out of 5 paddlers in that group had ran Splat and all had smooth lines. And Shane and I were talking about it, and I said, I think today's the day. And he said, really? And I was like, yeah, I think today's the day that I'll run it. And, it felt great that day. My lines were super crisp at everything above it. It was at a really, a good level, a fun level. And, I just felt awesome. I was like, yeah, today's the day.
That day it was 6.1, nice level, pretty standard flow, pretty standard day out there, all things considered. We got to Big Splat having no issues upstream, just normal, chill crew, chill day. And I was with Josh and James and Jim and John. And Josh had been talking to me about running Big Splat. He'd been watching me run it for about a year and a half or so, and he's kind of working his way up to it. And that day he was just kind of ready to try to hit it. And so they pulled over. They were checking my line out for my first run. Typically what I do is I run Big Splat just straight up, entrance down, and then I hike up, and then I'll get another lap in either from the middle down or from the entrance down again. It's really convenient that way. It's got kind of, we call it the yellow brick road. And it's got a nice little rock path that'll take you up back to the entrance of it. So, ran it straight up the first time. Good line, standard, good to go. 6.1. I mean, it's like the perfect flow. We kind of talked about it one last time. I gave Josh and James a kind of run through of what we're gonna do. We all agreed. Good plan. Pretty standard. I'll run us down Blue Angel style. Josh will be behind me, and James will be doing sweep. And we had John mid-rapid with a throw rope, and we had Jim at the seal launch, ready to either seal launch and be safety at the bottom, or ready with a throw rope if we needed it.
Shane, gave us a heads up. Hey, we're just gonna do 3 at a time, and we all knew the line pretty well. Shane took off, ran through the first hole, punched right through it, and I was right behind him. I punched through the hole and got a little bump on the nubber rock that you come through. And as soon as I came through that, I could actually see ahead of me a little bit better, and that's when I saw Shane actually go upside down. I drove through the booth and caught the eddy, and that was the point that John Rook gave me a shout, and he said, "Hey, he went over upside down." And at that point, I got to get my friend. So I took off out of the eddy and saw James running the drop itself. I gave him a little bit of time, being that I didn't want to land on him. And I drove through the drop and landed the booth. And as soon as I landed the booth, I started looking around. And I was like, well, where's Shane?
Shane was paddling a boat that was relatively new to him, and he hadn't really dialed in the outfitting yet. He flipped in the middle of the entrance rapid, and his roll attempts were hampered by the loose hip outfitting. Here's his description of his horrific flush over the falls and prolonged time under the water.
I led into it, dropped into the first little hole and around the guard rock. I think my left paddle caught a small little eddy crab on that left little eddy wall, and hindsight, I should have possibly leaned a little further forward and right, but I was already tipped over so far that I felt like in that split second, a back deck roll would be more appropriate. As I was completing the onside back deck roll, I washed over the flat iron rock and into the horseshoe hole, which is kind of a sticky spot in the middle of the rapid. So it's kind of the most dangerous line that I got washed into upside down. And when I got washed into that upside down, my right hip popped out. And when I went to pull up for another roll, I could feel my hip was just loosey-goosey. I knew I didn't have much time to rewrite everything, so I tried to pull it in quickly, pull my hip in, and then maybe give a roll attempt, and I could just feel that there was nothing I could do to roll back into this. My body's buoyancy was already kind of out of the boat, and so all I could do really was just tuck tight and honestly hope for the best. I was now going backwards upside down the rapid, and I could feel myself hit the entrance rock to the big waterfall, and then I felt myself kept moving. So I knew I didn't get pinned there, which was good, but I knew I was in for a bad ride now. So I just got washed over upside down, and my boat fully pitoned into the bottom of the river with me still in it. And then I just felt, at that moment, I felt a quick jolt. I felt some cracks inside of my torso, my chest cavity, and then I got violently ejected from my boat. I figured my skirt probably imploded, and somewhere along in the fray, I had my elbow pads ripped off, my hands, my paddle was ripped out of my hands, throw bag was ripped out of my PFD, my helmet was literally the strap was ripped off, and just the helmet was ripped off of my head. I was just getting tossed in this pit. I could feel I wasn't very strong in my arms and my torso for swimming, but I'd already been underwater for close to a minute at this point without a breath from the flip over. I never caught a breath before I went over the rapid, actually. So I kind of just remained calm. It was so quiet. I felt no pain. I didn't feel anything. I could feel my body getting thrashed around. I could feel my shoes getting ripped off of my feet. And in that, when I felt my shoes get pulled off of my feet, I kind of snapped back to whatever there is that I had left. And that's when I felt the current in my hands, and I started grabbing again. And I remember I opened my eyes again after, just to see where the hell I was, if I was still black, and I could see a little bit of light. And so I swam for that light as good as I could. I opened up again. I saw a little bit more light, and I just kind of reached up with my left hand. I could feel air. And so I pushed up with my left hand, and I pulled myself into the air. And being, knowing where I was, I knew that there was some challenging rapids down below. And one of them is a rock sieve, and it's right in the middle of the rapid, the follow-up rapid, which I was now swimming through without a helmet, without shoes, without, anything really. And so knowing that rock sieve is there and it's just the right size for a human body or a kayak, I swam for the right. I didn't want to go left because it's a lot harder to get left. I stayed with the current and stayed right. And I know there's a rock sieve in the middle, and then a little bit further right, there's a small line, and then another rock, and then a small line. And so I lunged for that second rock, and I just barely grabbed the front of it, enough to stop my feet from going into the sieve and pull my feet through that small little line right back into kind of a small eddy, which gave my friends who were safety kayaking, well, at that point now they're safety kayaking for me, it gave them an opportunity to catch up with me and then, let me grab onto my buddy James's boat, who ended up pulling me into the eddy. All I really remember is he's like, "Oh my God, are you all right?" And I was like, "Help me." All I could say was, "Help me." and then he just said, "Grab on." And I tried to grab onto his side rail of his Narvana and missed that. And I grabbed with all my strength on the last handhold and just grabbed in. I knew I would not make it if I had to swim another rapid. I could tell I was pretty wounded.
Pretty wounded indeed. As he'd found out later at the hospital, he had 10 broken ribs, 4 on the left and 6 on the right, and an L2 vertebral fracture, in addition to the concussion and prolonged underwater submersion. Luckily, despite the multiple broken ribs, his chest structure was still stable enough, and he didn't have any serious lung injury. Once he was out of the water and they regrouped, they were able to get a look at his condition.
And so I got out, laid on a flat rock for a little bit, kind of while I assessed everything. They asked if I need anything. I said, just get my gear, focus on that. I'm good. I can breathe more or less. It was labored, but I could do it. And, I kind of was able to get up and move around, and I kind of started assessing, how can I touch my fingers? Can I wiggle my toes? Where, I don't have a helmet on. I don't have anything. I don't have shoes. So I just kind of started doing some light pacing just to stay warm, because it wasn't freezing, but it was pretty darn cold, especially, my Kokatat dry suit had just gotten shredded. I mean, my whole left arm of my dry suit is just absolutely like a bear got a hold of it. There must have been a tree limb under there, that I got tangled up in or something.
So his left eye had some swelling for sure. It wasn't swollen shut, but you could tell his just on the top side of his brow was very puffy. Definitely moving very, very slow, moving very deliberately. He said that his back hurt, that he was having trouble breathing, that he couldn't take deep breaths. And then he said his left eye he's like, it's really strange. My left eye is really blurry. And James being an EMT and myself, in my background, we discussed it. We're like, well, he could have a head injury, strong concussion, which is really likely. I said the labored breathing, I said that could just be from being beat up, like he was. But we found out later it was, the broken ribs. And then his back, of course, we found out later was a cracked vertebrae, a fractured vertebrae. So as we talked to him, tried to assess him, I asked him, the simple stuff. I was like, well, you lost your shoes. What shoes were you wearing? And he could tell me exactly the shoes he was wearing. And I said, Shane, do you have to work tomorrow? Do you have anything going on tomorrow? And he's like, well, today's this day, and no, we don't have I don't have anything going on till after Christmas. I was like, okay, so he's with it. He doesn't have, altered levels of consciousness. At no point did he, as after he returned to the surface of the water, at no point did he lose consciousness. So he seemed as if he was totally with it and could make decisions for himself.
So at this point, it's worth looking at his condition using the framework of the ABCDEs of the primary trauma survey mentioned earlier. Now, this podcast is clearly not a substitute for formal training, but I want to demonstrate how you might approach the process. First of all, he can speak clearly and he has no trauma to the mouth or throat, so his airway is open and good. But his breathing is clearly impaired. This could be either from the blunt chest trauma or it could be from lung injury related to the submersion underwater. Either way, this could represent a life-threatening problem such as multiple rib fractures, pneumothorax, or bleeding within the chest cavity. Impaired breathing is a real emergency, and not a whole lot you can do to fix it on scene, so it should prompt immediate decisions about how to get an accident victim to definitive medical care as early as possible. Next is C for circulation, and his is good. He seems to be perfusing his brain and extremities, and he has no obvious bleeding. In terms of D for disability, you need to consider the head and the spine. While he had some evidence of concussion, he is currently alert, oriented, and seems to be fully coherent. The forehead swelling could be a marker of a more significant injury such as a skull fracture or intracranial bleeding, so he needs to be watched closely for any signs of decompensation such as confusion or irritability, vomiting, or severe headache. In this case, he has no neck pain, but quite a bit of low back pain, which seems to be worse with movement and walking, and suggests a possible fracture. This should prompt the idea of restricting his spinal movement in case the fracture is unstable, and brings up some real issues when figuring out extrication options, which we'll talk about in just a bit. To finish our primary survey, we have E for exposure. This generally means that you look the patient all over for additional injuries, deal with any extremity splinting or wound care, and think about hypothermia risk. Our patient is wet due to his ripped dry suit, and the ambient temperature is low, so while hypothermia generally takes a little while to set in, it must be on your radar screen if there's going to be any significant extrication delays. So back to the story. The group was able to find and collect almost all of his gear and figure out their next steps. They had a difficult decision to make regarding the extrication.
We started talking about, the condition he was in and what to do. He let us know that it was a lot more painful for him to walk than it was for him to just kind of set and edge and take little ducky paddles. We weighed the options there. It was, in the 30s, actually starting to snow, limited daylight, and we made the decision to, if Shane felt up to it, we could paddle him out, or I even offered, I was like, hey, if you don't feel up to it, we can float the pools and walk the rapids, and that's still going to be faster than us trying to hike you or even carry you to Wonder from here. James had mentioned, well, what about a medevac and a helicopter? And I was like, well, honestly, we could get Maryland Rescue 5 over here, but we're going to have to get them in a really open area. I don't know if they're going to be how low they'll be able to get in the gorge here. So, I just had in the back of my mind, I was like, well, the pre-flight on a helicopter is 45 minutes. Even just getting the blades turning is 45 minutes.
If you've ever been involved in an accident in the outdoors, you realize that daylight disappears quickly, and especially in the wintertime. It feels like time just accelerates towards darkness. So you really need to be moving efficiently towards the goal of getting the accident victim and the group safely out of that environment. In this case, all of the available extrication options involve some degree of additional risk for the injured paddler. That part of the gorge has very steep and rocky terrain, and even some cliff scrambling. The rest of the river contains multiple Class 3 and 4 rapids, and one that even approaches Class 5 difficulty. An outside rescue would likely mean significant delays and even nightfall and possible hypothermia, considering the cold temperatures and his wet clothing. A helicopter rescue in the tight and wooded river gorge would pose substantial risk for the flight crew, even if the weather was good and if they could find a reasonable spot to set up for a hoist. So the group had to factor in all of these issues, along with Shane's physical condition, his mental state, and the potential for worsening of his respiratory issue or his back injury.
It hurt to walk, it hurt to breathe. I didn't know the status of my injuries at that point or depth of them. But I knew I could paddle out. When I saw that I had my helmet, I knew we could figure it out, how to strap it on. And we actually had a small cam buckle that we used, and we cam buckled the helmet on. And that was actually pretty good. I was maybe even better than the original strap. And I knew the lines. I know the river. I've been paddling that river for so long. I knew the lines. I knew all the green tongues I was going to hit. So yeah, and I know what an extraction process would look like in that situation. I didn't want to put anyone else at risk like that. I've taken people out of the river, and I've been part of those kind of rescue events, and I know the amount of energy it takes to do that kind of stuff. And I knew that the path of least resistance was me paddling out.
And this is really the thing that I found most interesting about this story, how it illustrates the complex decision-making that has to happen with this type of injury in the wilderness. If you follow the old textbook approach to patients with a suspected spinal injury, the general recommendation would be to provide spinal immobilization to help to reduce the risk of cord injury. This would involve a litter extrication with significant time and resources. More recent recommendations from the Wilderness Medical Society and the EMS literature have softened the approach and suggest using the idea of spinal motion restriction rather than full immobilization. Spinal motion restriction just means doing what you can to stay in a neutral position as much as possible and minimizing rotational or loading forces on the spine. In this case, Shane's breathing issues and hypothermia risk could both represent life-threatening problems, and in both his and his group's opinion took precedence over the possible spinal risk. So the decision to get out under his own power seems well justified. It's critical that he was able to participate in the decision process, that he could help judge his own physical limitations, and that the group maintained good communication about these issues as they went. Paddling out is what he wanted to do, what his group felt was right, and it worked out. But every rescue and extrication is different, and you have to just make the best decisions you can with the information you have available at the time. Sometimes the right thing to do is to activate EMS or the local search and rescue agency. They could have easily justified that here. For patients that have significant change in their mental status or have obvious life-threatening injuries or evidence of instability, don't hesitate to make that call, because time is critical in their management. In those situations, it's better to get EMS involved early in the process so they can mobilize the resources they need to help you. Overall, the important thing for all of us is to educate and prepare ourselves for these scenarios so that we have the right mental tools to make these tough decisions. If you want to learn more about this, Wilderness First Aid and Wilderness First Responder courses are a great starting point.
And then I just paddled out really slowly. I didn't have any strength in my arm or my pulling, so I would just kind of duck dip on left and right. If I had to, I would take a big sacrificial paddle slap to keep myself upright. And then I hiked First Island and paddled the rest of it, which was excruciating.
It went pretty smooth. I will say it was probably the most eerie time I've ever had paddling. No one said a word other than asking Shane how he was. No one hit a booth, no one surfed. It was all raft lines and get out of there as fast and as safe as possible.
All of the crew, as we were paddling out, I just want to mention, there was a few moments where, I thought maybe I shouldn't be paddling. I could feel my back was hurting. I said, I don't know if I can do this, guys. And they said, it was like the positivity is like, you can do this. It wasn't a question in their mind. And I think that really helped me out a lot. Is just knowing my team had my back.
We hit the takeout, and his pain had increased quite a bit by this point. It was difficult for him to walk. We got him up to the car and helped him out of his dry suit, got him into the passenger seat of James's car. The car was nice and warm. He had some snacks, some ibuprofen ready for him, and then they took off for the hospital.
From the takeout, it was about a half-hour drive to the West Virginia University Trauma Center at Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown.
And then we got to Ruby. I walked in with my wet socks and found the first wheelchair to sit in, and they, checked me in. And within a minute of checking in, I was, I was on the trauma table. Just stayed real positive with everybody working on me, and it was actually really nice being in West Virginia, being a local that I am, working at Pathfinder, knowing the adventure crowd, the bicyclists. One of the doctors, the trauma attending doctor who cared for me, she's actually a cyclocross bicyclist, and 2 days prior, she was doing a gravel ride, and she saw our crew. We were about to put in the Big Sandy, and so it's kind of this really serendipitous moment. We both looked at each other. She's like, were you out on the Big Sandy the other day? I was like, yes, ma'am, I was. and she's like, oh, I will take care of you. So they just took good care of me. I didn't really know a full breakdown of my injuries until the next day when I was able to talk to the doctor.
Rib fractures are incredibly painful. It's hard to imagine what 10 of them would feel like. I recorded this interview with Shane about 3 weeks after his injury, and he was making a quick recovery. He was remarkably positive about his injury and its healing process.
I didn't take any opioids. You know, I think I had some Advils. That was like the big pain relief I took. But I don't need that stuff, you know, and I haven't used it in my healing either. It's like, for me, I'm a big natural guy. I'm a believer of my body wants to find homeostasis, and I've been doing a lot of bone broth and bone marrow daily for the last 3 weeks. You know, that's been a really powerful tool for sure. I will say in these last 3 weeks, I have taken nothing for granted. You know, what a great gift the river has shared with me.
Shane was very appreciative to all of his rescuers, Josh Martin, Jim Murtha, John Rook, and James Malik, along with all of his friends and family that helped him in his recovery process. Shane and James posted an accident report on the AW database and mentioned some good learning points from the incident. In addition to having dry suits and other appropriate gear for rescue and a strong crew that you trust, they credited Shane's survival to staying in his boat over the drop. They felt the buoyancy of the boat and the protection it provided really prevented a worse outcome. So after hearing this story, it reminded me of another incident on the Big Sandy. I spent about a decade living in Morgantown, working at WVU Hospital, the same hospital mentioned here by Shane. I had the good fortune of working with many fantastic people there, and it was a great place to be as a paddler. There's a huge collection of creeks and rivers within easy access of town, and even some Class 5 boating within the actual city limits. There was this old story from the 1980s floating around there about a paddler showing up to the ER in the back of a pickup truck, still sitting in his boat with 2 broken legs. The paddler involved was Jeff Snyder. He probably doesn't need an introduction, but in case you're not familiar with him, he's one of the legends of our sport. He pioneered a lot of the steep creeks in that area of northern West Virginia, and with his brother Jim and a few other folks, pretty much created the sports of downriver freestyle paddling, squirt boating, striding, which is the initial version of stand-up paddling, and who knows what else. In the mid-'80s, Jim was designing and building these glass boats with radically low-cut ends to engage with the subsurface currents in the river, and Jeff was the main test pilot. And of course, with radical innovation, you might expect a few crashes. I wanted to finally hear this story directly from him, and he was kind enough to share it with us here.
Long time ago, it was before 84 or 5, back when I only had one boat, and probably the first few years I actually lived down here. I was in a squirt boat that now hangs on my garage. I later took down the Grand Canyon and stuff. It's a little dinky boat that weighs like 50, 60 pounds, so you know the theme. It didn't hardly float. The Baby Ark is how it's described, which was like Jim's first true 3D squirt boat, where either end was obtainable to water at any time. You could cartwheel on demand in this boat for the first time in reality. Otherwise, up until here, it had been a dream. And it would have worked for Jim, but it was too small for him. It didn't really float him right. But yet somehow it fit me, and I quickly adopted it. And, you know, it's really the start of the charm to my lucky test pilot phase of life or whatever. And down in the bottom, I'd say about 2/3 way down, there used to be an old cable across the river just below it. And there's some iron rings in the rock in the middle of the river. And on the left side of the river, there's like a not quite shoulder high, boofish kind of into an eddy move that people inherently want to run. And then you peel out on the left side of the river downstream, and you'd go in between that rock that held that ring and another rock on the way left and on down the river. Well, this day that I did things poorly, as hindsight would have it, I went in with, you know how especially in a boating world like ours, you need to be very deliberate at every given moment. And so I had less of an appetite of that when I was a younger man, and I did things more on an experimental basis where it was like, well, I'll start out like this and see where it goes from there kind of thing. I came out of that eddy. I wanted to do a screw up. You know what that is. And so as I went out and did my screw up, before I completed it, the bottom of my stern tapped the bottom of the river, and that forced the nose down crossways across that channel. And so now I'm suspended in between 2 points, and I'm in the middle, and the water's adding up on me. Well, the boat and my leg couldn't take it. So the boat folded, and I guess only by the grace of God, as I wiggled when I knew I wasn't coming free easily, and that's what set things into motion. It went kaping, and my leg broke, and it hurt immensely, and it's like, just think you ought to be blacking out, painful kind of thing. And I managed to get to the shore, probably had some people's help, but that's when the people's help really started being a multiplier of how things went from there. And they pulled me the best they could out of that boat, which is almost unimaginable, because even before the boat was folded and I had 2 good legs, I really had to stuff my way into this boat that was, it's about 4.5 inches top to bottom. And so you put a big kink in that with your legs in that, it doesn't want to let you back out real easy. And now the nose of the boat was really within a foot or so of the nose of my face, with me knowing my legs in there. This is bad math, right? You feel like you're in a car wreck. You almost think you're going to pass out, but you don't. And every time it gets a little better, they wait a little bit. Nothing's happening fast, but other people are laying the plans, and you're just concentrating on breathing and not passing out or puking. And sure enough, they put me in like a dancer or something. And I think they even tried splinting my leg before they put me in that. And then I paddled my ass out from there. And that was a little better because I had something to focus on, but it was also a little bit like that feeling we all know we love a little bit when we put on, where we know that we're kind of gambling with all the marbles. Well, that's like under a real microscope at a moment like this. And now you're not so sure about your gamble anymore, and certainly not at this moment. But again, there's enough prevailing heads there where they're like, no, you don't walk out from here. We picked the whole boat up. And they put me in the back of my waiting truck and drove me to Morgantown in the kayak. It literally took a couple hours because I could feel every freaking size piece of gravel that was bigger than a walnut, because I was so hypersensitive to my brake. I really didn't know how bad what was, but it was obviously the right one was way fucked up. And I was in a horrible amount of pain. It was just terrible. And so, well, they had their first guy waltzes right out of the hospital to come greet us as we roll up to the station, and they take the boat out of the back of the truck, and as soon as it hits the ground, he's like ready to pull me out of the boat like I'm stuck in there by my armpits. And my brother pulls him back a little bit and says, now, wait a minute here. He hurts him really bad. You better give him something before you go tugging on him much, right? And they're like, yeah, well, we do that inside, not outside, yada, yada, yada. And I was pretty bad off by this point, really. But it got a tibial nail, which was left in there way too long. And then fortunately, later on again, that was taken out for me.
Jeff, of course, recovered and went on to push the boundaries of whitewater paddling for many years. Some of his old videos featuring the early days of squirt boating and steep creek kayaking are now on YouTube. And if you have a little bit of free time, it's worth a quick trip down that rabbit hole to see where our sport came from. There's also a new film series called Freeland by Justin Harris that features Jeff and some of the other paddlers from that same time and space as they explored the possibilities of whitewater paddling in northern West Virginia. Thanks for listening today. In the interest of time and attention, there were a lot of things that we glossed over or didn't even mention in the trauma assessment earlier. At some point, I'd like to do a closer look at head and neck injuries in particular. So if you've got a good story, send it my way. Jeff gets the last word here with some reflections on his career of experimental paddling and the lessons learned along the way. Like I said, they don't make him much tougher than this.
So it is my nature to challenge myself or push limits or whatever, but basically I am a slow learner, admittedly. You know, more importantly is I had something where I started out with way worse than what I ended up with. By the time I got to things like my near adultness of being able to move away from home and become a boater, boating was actually saving me, even though it was like an every 10-year thing where I'd go to the hospital for a major ripping something off or breaking something or whatever. One of these do not repeat things. And so I did end up breaking my neck eventually, and Decker's Creek almost killed me, as well as a number of other places. Nature was constantly trying to make me slow down and do a better job of assessing my risk to reward merit system. And as we get older, we get better at dialing that back or in a little bit. But when we learn something, especially learn something the hard way, most of us that are really well healed wouldn't have traded that moment in if they could have relived it, because you do come out wiser. All I can do is say, plan a better line than coming out upside down out of your next eddy. Stay away from the screw-ups.
Thank you for listening to The Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button and click follow on our Facebook page so we know that you're out there. I'm also looking for more stories. If you know of an interesting non-fatal river accident or rescue, send me a few details by email, safetybreak@gmail.com. It doesn't have to be dramatic or life-threatening, just something that we all might be able to learn from. I'll see if we can turn it into an episode. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the river.